Well, good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all. My name is Gilles Carbonnier. I'm a professor of development economics here at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. And it's my pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all of you at the Graduate Institute for an event entitled Local and Indigenous Approaches to Humanitarian Aid and Disaster Risk Reduction. This is an event that we jointly organized between here our center, Research Center on Conflict Development and Peace Building, the CCDP, together with the newsroom, the New Humanitarian, formerly IRIN News, and with the director of the New Humanitarian, Heba Ali, whom I also welcome in this event. We are very glad to co-organize that event together with you in the framework of the 6th session of the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction that is bringing thousands, from what I heard, thousands of delegates here to Geneva to discuss, among many other things, how can local, national responders, actors, institutions better deal with disaster risks, reduce such risks, manage such risks across the world. Heba Ali has proposed that I say a few words of introduction on the question of localizing aid, on the question of promoting the capacities of local and national responders to be the one in the driver's seat in order to deal with so-called humanitarian responses. And then I will give her the floor to Heba to introduce the panel discussion that we will have. So localization has become quite a topic in the humanitarian sector a few years back, just actually at the World Humanitarian Summit, which was taking place in Istanbul in 2016. And localization of aid became quite an issue because in the run-up to the World Humanitarian Summit, the UN has consulted, I think, over 20,000 people in over 150 countries. And what really came out of those consultations, and I quote, is that local and national responders, actors, expressed large frustration, and which was not a new frustration, as they struggle to be seen by the international community as the primary agents of response, and they struggle to try to access resources, and they feel pushed aside by international actors rather than respected and strengthened. End of quote. So the message was, I think, quite clear. And this is why during the World Humanitarian Summit, participants agreed that they would not only pursue an agenda of localization, but they would commit to provide a quarter of total international humanitarian assistance as directly as possible, directly to local and national responders. And when we know that a few years back, we had less, or just 2% of total international humanitarian assistance going directly as first responders to local and national actors, we realized that from less than 2% to 25%, there is a huge gap. And needless to say, we are very far from it today, just 1 year before the 2020 deadline. So I was thinking that this localization of aid actually took quite some years to make it into the humanitarian sector and the humanitarian community. If we look more broadly at foreign aid, it's, I think, that the buzzwords of participation, of ownership have been there for decades in the 1960s and 70s. And I think this crystallized quite a lot through the so-called Paris Declaration on the Aid Effectiveness, which is a declaration signed both by donor countries, but also what was called recipient countries, which then was called partner countries, And the first principle is the principle of ownership, meaning that in 2005, both donors and partner countries recognized that actually aid conditionality imposed by donors does not work. And it hasn't worked for decades. So what needs to happen is actually that partner countries own their development strategies, development policies, and processes. And then donors should align their support, should align their policies to the strategies and the policies that are adopted by national actors. So these twin concepts or principles of ownership and alignment made it, at least at the discursive level, in the development world, and it took 10 years in the humanitarian world to make it through the notion of localizing aid. Also because everybody realized that we are facing ever more protracted crises that last not over several decades, but often over generations, and that even if it's humanitarian action, it's often action that lags over a very long period of time, and that is not just externally driven in a short time span in response to an emergency. So now if I want to a bit critically look at what were the dynamics underlying this new call for localization, I can see a push from southern host countries and a push from the north and from donor countries. I think the main push from the south has been the fact that many former low-income countries made it and graduated to what we call middle-income countries with much greater capacities to deal with humanitarian emergencies. And we have seen emerging countries such as India, Indonesia saying, well, we have had an emergency, a disaster, but actually we don't need your assistance. We can manage by our own. And on the other hand, I think there is also been quite a call for what I would call in the academic world, the decolonization of knowledge. We have had a fantastic conversation with colleagues in South Africa, asking for a decolonization, or at least recognizing a diversity of knowledge ecologies and giving much greater attention to indigenous knowledge, to locally produced knowledge, instead of imposing our own paradigms and epistemologies on whatever realities we are dealing with. And I think this translated also in the policy world for a call for decolonization of governance, decision-making, and management of staff in humanitarian organizations. I think we have seen more and more tension in international aid organization between so-called expatriates versus locals, and a lot of so-called locals not accepting anymore this dichotomy and a need to rethink completely this dichotomy, which doesn't make sense. From the north, we have seen also a push, I think first because of budgetary constraints, so a wish to reduce possibly transaction costs by having less intermediaries from the donor to the last responder, which is actually the first responder because it's the responder which directly responds to the needs of people affected by an emergency. And we have seen also a call for bringing new donors into the humanitarian system, new donors also from the south, but who had embraced South-South cooperation as a model. And through South-South cooperation, mainly states from the south directly supporting via financial assistance and technical assistance other states struck by disasters or trying to build their disaster preparedness and risk reduction capacities. At the same time, I think through protracted crisis, the Western liberal democracies who thought that they had the capacity to solve the question of fragility through externally driven interventions had to recognize the failure of such externally driven interventions and the need to work with and through local institutions to facilitate a transformative process from within. So we have seen a shift from what was called securitization, stabilization, to resilience. And maybe through that, also the idea that if problems cannot be fixed quickly from outside and they are too murky and complex, at least such problems can be contained and managed locally or more locally while avoiding the contagion of those issues through either migratory pressures or through pandemics and the likes. So I think part of this support by Western donors is also, recognition that resilience might be a better take, less expensive and possibly also more successful in just containing crises rather than solving them. So in this context, I think it is a great opportunity tonight to have a study with a lot of testimonies and that have been done by a number of panelists whom we will hear, who have conducted case studies on voices from local responders, from local institutions and indigenous communities, and to present this discussion and the studies that have been conducted with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through the nonprofit newsroom, The New Humanitarians, to look at what local aid workers and frontline humanitarian responders around the world are telling us. I will call to the floor Heba Ali, who is a journalist has worked with many different renowned outlets on humanitarian terrain, in humanitarian crisis, all the way from Africa to the Middle East and Asia, and who is now the director of the New Humanitarian, which is the new incarnation of what was known as IRIN News. So Heba, I have the pleasure to give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. And what Gilles failed to mention is that he, as of a year ago, is also the vice president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. So we are very honored to have him with us tonight. And he also brings that practitioner perspective to complement what I think was very useful historical and academic context that roots today's discussion. This is the latest in our event series, In Conversation with the New Humanitarian. And I also want to welcome the audience that is watching online and remind everyone that we also have some live translation. So please do speak when you're speaking at a pace that won't drive our poor translator who's been working all day bonkers. Gilles has mentioned already our rebrand, and I just wanted to speak for a minute about why we changed our name, because it's quite linked to today's discussion. The New Humanitarian was meant in part to reflect our break from the United Nations, which we spun off from in 2015, but also to reflect a changing humanitarian landscape with new threats that are facing us, from climate change to protracted crises, and new approaches that are needed to deal with the scale of needs today. And that, for us, symbolizes kind of a new humanitarianism for the modern era that we try to chronicle through our journalism. And lastly, we're seeking to reach new humanitarians as readers, and we hope that all of you will become among those readers. And if you're interested in subscribing to our work, at the end of the event, you can leave your business card at the back with my colleagues and get daily digests in your inbox every day. So tonight, the reason we've gathered is that as Jean mentioned, on the sidelines of the global platform, so often these high-level policy discussions fail to actually incorporate and consult the views of the people that they are meant to be serving, and disaster risk reduction and humanitarian action are no exception to that rule. So in late 2017, with the support of the Gates Foundation, and you'll hear from them later, we embarked on a project to try to tell those stories and really bring the voices of those frontline responders to the fore. At the same time, a researcher, or he'll argue he's not a researcher, but he has done some research. John Scott, who you'll meet in a minute, visited Maori communities of New Zealand and Inuit Indigenous communities of Northern Canada to look at Indigenous approaches to disaster risk reduction and what the international community can learn from that. So we're going to share with you a little bit our takeaways from this year-long project. We published 35 stories and counting from as far as Venezuela to Bangladesh. And you'll get to meet the editor who's been leading that reporting shortly. But in the meantime, we wanted to kick off, to give you a little bit of a taste of the kind of work that we're doing, kick off the discussion with a video that we have produced. We visited 3 different crises from Kenya to Lebanon and Bangladesh to look at what local aid really looks like on the ground and how grassroots responders feel about this increasingly divisive debate. So we'll play the video and then we'll jump into the discussion. Thank you.
For me, localization means giving the local communities an opportunity to make decisions and implement those decisions that they feel are more important to them. The community are in the front seat and driving the initiatives. It's not somebody from outside, it's the community themselves doing it.
بال 2012 بلشت الأزمة السورية، صاروا يفوتوا النازحين على الضياع. لقينا إنه المجتمع المحلي ما عم بيشارك بالأزمة. طرحنا مشروع نعمل مجموعات طوارئ بضياع تساعد البلديات لحتى يساعدوا النازحين. فكان تركيزنا من الأول على المجتمع المحلي اللي بيقدر يساعد، لأنه هو بيعرف الإشكالية أكتر وهو ابن المنطقة يعني. بال 2014 نحن طلبنا من الجمعيات الانترناسيونال انه اشتغلوا مع اللوكل. كان الجواب واضح انه هيدي امرجنسي نشتغل مع اشخاص اختصاص. كانت الفكره مزبوطه بوقتها، بس فكره الامرجنسي بتكون ظابطه على 5 أشهر ماكسيموم.
Conflicts are very, very tricky. You need to be very, very sensitive and make sure whatever intervention you are bringing in is not worsening the situation. The local aid workers are very, very important to humanitarian aid response. Why? One, because of the knowledge. Even moving from point A to point B, I can tell you how much time you can take, which areas are dangerous. Two, I'm known to the communities there. And I understand their culture, which is very important.
Posudin Khan Research Foundation has been in the ground since 2017 when the crisis began. We are local people, we are in Bangladesh, and the refugees came inside Bangladesh. So we were able to respond the fastest among all other aid workers because we are present here. We conducted a needs assessment, and through that we found that there was a huge need for palliative care. One more thing that we have advantage is over cost. See, when we are working locally, we are able to recruit health workers and other staffs at a very economical salary, unlike the international aid workers.
To provide a really good service in this Rohingya camp, we need more people, more trained doctors, nurses, more palliative care assistants and managers to supervise them. We need to train them. Funding is a major barrier. Actually, one of the organization told us that they will fund for this program, but later they denied. So it was not possible for us to maintain the salaries and other expenditure.
One of the things that the local aid organizations struggle with is funding. You'll find most of the institutional donors will not fund our local organizations because funding is tied to so many conditionalities that these groups cannot be able to meet. You see, these local organizations have been operating in their own ways. When a specific intervention ends or the project is finished, because projects have a lifetime, then these groups are left there frustrated because they are no longer able to sustain the structures. It just ends there and it's never sustainable at all. Most of these international organizations, they'll talk of partnership. Partnership means you come together. How can we have more negotiations, more balanced relationships? The local organizations have the power within themselves.
We are lacking the fund, and sometimes we may be lacking the technical capacity. So we need the support from the international aid agencies to build our local agencies, the local aid workers' capacities. Of course, it's not about being equal, being less or more. It's about working together to ensuring that we are able to provide a fantastic humanitarian climate for the Rohingya refugees.
يعني نحن جمعية محلية. الإمكانيات تبعنا إذا استثمرناها تشتغل فعلا بأهداف محددة وواضحة بدعم الجمعيات العالمية الانترناسيونال بيكون كتير منيح هذا الوضع. بنجرب نسكر الثغرات، نقدر نحل مشكلة هيدا الجيل. أكيد رح نلعب دور كتير مهم، رح نغير حياة أشخاص أكيد، بس العدد الكبير هو عم بيكون شغلة صعبة، يعني منه سهل وبده كتير شغل.
I can't hear myself, but you can hear me. For those of you who are in the back, please feel free to come grab a seat. There are plenty here in the front. And I'm now going to invite on stage the two people that have been behind this work over the last year. So Erwin Loy, who is an editor at the New Humanitarian, which we haven't actually noted, for those of you who don't know us, is an independent, come on up, nonprofit newsroom that reports about humanitarian crises. And John Scott, who is the president of the Center for Public Service Communications, which is a consultancy that supports others to improve health services for underserved communities through information technologies, among other things. But John is a member of the Tlingit Indigenous community of Alaska and has personally visited the two communities I mentioned earlier to look at how they view DRR. And in fact, this is the culmination of a long career at the intersection of communication, risk reduction, and Indigenous communities, including with UNISDR, also rebranded recently to UNDRR and others. So welcome to you both. We're going to try to cover the whole spectrum from DRR to humanitarian response, and that's intentional because often I find these conversations are held in silos, and yet it's really the same conversation happening in different rooms. So localization is localization, kind of whichever sector it happens in. And I'm going to turn to many of you in the room as well, because we've got a rich audience and people who are not actually normally based in Geneva, who are here as a result of the platform and who have direct field experience on this as well. A few reminders: we've got the hashtag up on the screen, hashtag local aid, and GP 2019 Geneva for the global platform. Our handles are also up there, New Humanitarian and IHEID for the Graduate Institute, and the Wi-Fi code is also on the screen. And a reminder again that if you are speaking from the floor, the cameras are in the back, so if you'd like the online audience to see you, you will awkwardly have to turn around. So, Erwin, I wanted to start with you. You've been leading our reporting on locally led humanitarian response, and I'd just love to hear some of the stories you came across and the ones that struck you the most.
Yeah, that's right. We've been doing this for the last year or so, and the reporting is continuing. So we've covered a range of crises from around the world. So it's hard to kind of zero in on a few, but I think the ones that stuck out to me were ones that involved, I suppose, unexpected responders, volunteers that were coming together. And to me, I was impressed with how well organized some of these quote-unquote spontaneous responses were. So one was, a big crisis last year in Indonesia, the Sulawesi earthquakes and tsunamis that happened. And that was, a lot of, obviously, damage early on. There were a lot of access issues that the government and international aid groups who wanted to be involved could not access some of these locations for the longest time, probably too long, I think these communities would tell you. And so a lot of the first responders to visit some of these remote communities were, in fact, these local volunteer groups. And I was just impressed by how organized they were. They were communicating with each other via social media and WhatsApp, and they managed to have a semblance of their own structure, but they weren't included in the larger humanitarian response that eventually, came to be led by the government. And so I think that's an interesting element going forward, because in a country like Indonesia and many countries in Asia and all over the world increasingly, there are stronger, more assertive governments, and it's no longer a given that an international aid response can just show up and do whatever it so wants to do. So I think looking at these sorts of local volunteer responses are interesting, because they have formed these sorts of networks from their own work in civil society and human rights and women's rights, and they don't think of themselves as humanitarians, but that's the work they do when a crisis hits. And so similarly, for different reasons, as well as in Venezuela, we wanted to look at what humanitarian response looks like in a crisis where the government denies that there is a crisis. And so, we focused on a lot of these tiny local micro NGOs, we call them. They're basically registered foundations, sometimes with 2 or 3 members, and they're doing the work of humanitarian aid without calling it that. They're setting up public kitchens, they're sourcing medication, and obviously that's a bit more rare these days in Venezuela. And so I thought, those were two stories that really stuck out at me because of these sorts of non-traditional humanitarian responders.
And is there response all that non-traditional, even though they are non-traditional?
Is the response not traditional?
Yeah, I mean, what's different about their approach? We heard in the video, that local organizations are closer to the ground, they know the communities, et cetera. But what did you see in terms of the nature of the response that might identify it?
Well, that's the thing. I don't think it is different in that sense. They're doing what they've always been doing, what every local group has been doing in any crisis since the beginning of time. You respond because you can and because you have the ability to, and what you think needs to be done. I guess say in Indonesia, the problem was that it wasn't part of the overall system. It wasn't part of the official system, so it's not coordinated with the people that have the bulk of the funding and the bulk of the physical goods. So I think for the broader aid sector, I think it's a question of how do you work this sort of local response capacity into your plans before a crisis happens, because these people exist and they are well organized, even if they don't consider themselves to be humanitarians.
And I remember when I visited Syria, and some of you in the room will relate to this, at the time the international community was having huge problems accessing, and they knew that these local networks of volunteers existed, but they just couldn't tap into them, which just seemed like such a waste. John, I wanted to turn to you. You visited 2 Indigenous communities, the Inuit of Northern Canada and the Maori of New Zealand. Tell us kind of what these communities are like and what's their approach to DRR.
Sure, and very briefly, I'll respond to the comment that you made. I had not I had identified myself as not a researcher, and that is really to protect researchers. In the context of this project, my visit to New Zealand and working with Maori was 10 days, and Inuit in Canada was 7 days. And so that in and of itself has to be said so that you understand that these were snapshots that I got and not in-depth research, though I did do a lot of reading and subsequent interviews. And what I tend to do, aside from capturing the interviews in the voice of the interviewee and from their perspective as they define terminology, what I tend to look for is maybe the smaller voices or the voices that and the messages that don't get heard in that broader risk reduction community, for example, within ISDR or other international organizations, and hope then to bring that voice to fora like this. And to keep on track with the two that I visited, thank you to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and my project manager, Ms. Pacheco, who's in the audience with us. It was a wonderful experience, but contrast to what Loy was saying in that it's not, we've invented for ourselves years ago this dichotomy between natural hazard risk reduction and humanitarian emergency. And I understand why I was a part of that establishment of that dichotomy back when it happened, but we find over time that there is a lot of similarity between the driving forces. And so what I found, I went to two communities that did not have humanitarian crises, but did define disasters and emergencies and risk in their own terms. And they are more existential, longer-term kinds of things that have to do particularly with climate change and with land use management, and much of it in both cases coming from a history of colonialism where, and arguably, I'll try to stick to the two examples of the two places I visited in this project, but I think there's some universality about colonialism and the question of whether or not any indigenous community can really practice its worldview and use its indigenous knowledge to reduce risk, given the structures, the political and economic structures that they have.
Could you walk us through what those values and that
Sure.
kind of lifestyle looks like in, pre-colonial?
Yeah, sure. Well, in pre-colonial times, and again, I'm generalizing, and even as I get specific about the Inuit in one particular town in Canada, and Maori, and I did travel throughout the country in New Zealand. One of the things that that had historic value in terms of what we might consider risk reduction strategies is the worldview where individuals, where humans were only a part of the equation and weren't even the first part of the equation. So humans, streams, rivers, mountains, forests have equal value. And indigenous communities, and I think there's some universality in this too. Indigenous communities think in those terms and don't think about land as something that one owns and one can buy and sell or do what they want to it. And so in terms of risk reduction strategies, for example, in New Zealand with Maori, volcanoes are evident and common. They don't erupt frequently, but they are a strong presence. But they're considered family. And historically, volcanoes, and still to this day to Maori, are sacred land. And so people didn't build on sacred land. It might have been that that was a specific risk reduction strategy that was employed, using the sacred land as a way to keep people away. But nevertheless, it resulted in fewer people living near the threat. And then you had the vegetation or the trees or the crops that were grown were native and sustained rivers, whereas once colonialism, and it's still going on, the kinds of crops that were chosen, bringing in cattle and sheep, and choosing the kind of trees that would grow along river, exacerbated the problem that comes along with climate change and a changing climate. And the rivers then erode their banks, become muddy. It does not necessarily cause flooding, though there is flooding, but that's not the existential threat. The threat is the loss of the fisheries, which again are sacred to them. The food that they eat is not just nourishment, it's sacred, which is also common in many indigenous communities, that the animals and trees and plants are thanked for giving themselves as nourishment to individuals.
And to what extent does the mainstream disaster risk reduction narrative incorporate these different views of what a disaster is?
I would say increasingly they do, but again, I'm talking about New Zealand and Canada. So this, although it would be argued by some Maori and some Inuit, it's a less stressful situation than an indigenous community in Brazil who has a greater political difficulty. But what's happening, and I think we'll get to education as an example, and it was brought up in your movie. I was really happy to see that link. One of the things that there are vulnerable populations in majority communities, that's for sure, in all countries. One of the things that distinguishes, I think, or makes unique the vulnerability of some indigenous communities is culture. And it's the fact that the risk is that culture is being lost because languages are being lost, because ways of lives are being lost. And it takes educated and activist communities to represent the need for that long-term development, so that as they interact with the majority communities in economics or in health or in agriculture or in public policy, they have the experience and the knowledge together with their worldview that can then start to sway the tide to change behavior back more to the traditional policies and land use management that they would have wanted.
But at the heart of that is it seems to me, kind of a, you talked about representation, but a lack of representation or a voice in certain situations to have that worldview kind of communicated. And that echoes, I think, a lot of what you found in the reporting, that while often the debates that we have, at least at the policy level here in Geneva, around building resilience at the local level and supporting locally led humanitarian action, center around how much money is going to local actors, and that came up also in the film. But it seems to me a lot of what you found was actually more around the need to feel represented and heard.
Yeah, that's true. I'd say it's both things. I think there are two levels here. Obviously, the funding and the sorts of traditional promises around localization are definitely important. But it seems like the one of the more emotional aspects is this feeling that this perception that they haven't been heard, that they haven't been given a voice throughout, media coverage, throughout obviously during humanitarian responses themselves, coordination meetings. They're not involved in these sorts of very important things. And so, it struck me, I think, working on this project is how often you would hear, oh, this is the first time that we've been in a news story, or this is the first time that that people have asked us about this stuff. And you're just doing, like for some of these individuals, it's a very big deal because it can be so rare for certain organizations, especially smaller ones that don't have communication staff or don't have that sort of sensibility to try and seek out coverage and that kind of thing. So I think for us, I think the parallel for us as a media organization, we are not a humanitarian organization. We cover the humanitarian sector. So the parallel for us, I think, is a matter of representation. I think it's parallel to the broader debate around representation that's going on in society, around minority representation in media, women's representation in media. I see the same links for local representation in our stories, because if you're not including locals in your stories as experts, as agents of their own outcomes, then it's not really telling the full story. So I think that's how we view this reporting, and that's where the representation comes in from our points of view.
But why do you think there is so little of it?
There are practical reasons. In a fast-breaking crisis and breaking news, I think most media, you go to whoever's available. And who's available? It's a UN organization with communication staff. It's an INGO that has communication staff that are bigger than most newsrooms, and they're sending out press releases, and so that's what you go with. But also, I think it's a matter of you do have to take that extra effort to try and find these local voices. If you're coming at it if you're writing a story from Bangkok, where I'm based, and there's a disaster happening somewhere else, then it does take a bit of extra effort. And I think that I just find that interesting. The parallel, localization is not something that we in the media, it's not our issue, but it's the issue of the sector that we cover. And to me, the parallel is getting these local voices. And it's funny how similar the issues are. I think early on it's easy to criticize international aid actors for not doing more, for not having more progress. But then you look at yourself and well, how many local voices do I feature in my stories? And I actually counted it up a year ago, and it was not very much. So I don't know, these sorts of parallels I think are quite interesting for us covering the sector, but not committing to these specific goals, because that's not what we do. But
I want to turn to someone in the audience. If we could just bring a mic down to Samah Kassab, who is a Palestinian aid worker working with Action Aid to build resilience in Gaza. And I just wanted to get your reactions to this. It should work, I think, to this point of local organizations feeling like they are not heard and not represented. And it was shocking to me, actually, when we got tweets in response to some of our stories saying this is so remarkable because they were actually naming these organizations, and just that was enough of a change from the norm that got people excited. So how are you seeing things on the ground?
Okay, thank you. My name is Samah Kassab. I'm working at Action Aid Palestine, and I am Palestinian. I want to put all of you in the context in Palestine. We have special and complicated context because of many issues. The first is the occupation. As you know, Palestine is occupied still now. Daily violation, Palestinian suffering always and daily from violation, and we have a protracted crisis all the time because of the war on Gaza, and because of the blockade, on the West Bank and installments, as you know, and the siege around Gaza. This led us in the complicated humanitarian crisis. which I want to talk about is the need of the international and associations and organizations, clusters, and the need of the importance of the effective relation between the international organizations and the local organizations. Why I talking about this? Because we have also internal division, Palestinian division between Gaza and the West Bank, with let us between two kinds of crisis, internal and outside or occupation crisis. So when we speak about the humanitarian intervention and the international intervention, I think we need to make more localization for the local organization. If I want to sharing with you our experience in Gaza. We are implementing now with partner associations in Gaza a big program, Rights and Resilience Program, which make empowerment for women and youth in Gaza to make the lead in the humanitarian work. We formed in partnership with local organizations. We formed preparedness and response committees led by women. And they take the capacity building in the preparedness and interventions and IHL laws and humanitarian core humanitarian standards and how to respond for emergencies, because we are always suffer and faces the protracted crisis. After
Samah,
that,
I'm just going to jump in because you're talking about the core humanitarian standards of IHL. You have all the lingo of an international aid worker.
Yes.
How are you seen by international aid workers in your own country? What's the relationship like when the international operation comes in?
Usually the planning of the humanitarian work for international organizations, the plans which put from them, not sharing with the local organization, or they sharing in a shrinkage space, not in the planning and not in the assessments, not in the evaluation. So they told the local organization, okay, we have a fund, which is little fund. We have a fund, so we will give you like a nutrition or like food in the crisis or in the war. So they didn't discuss with the local affected people, women, youth, what you need, what is your needs, because the local organization is the most one who know what is their needs. So it's our conflict we have. Also, I have another crisis.
Let's get to the other crisis a bit later, because I want to leave enough time to make the rounds, but I can hear already in your voice the kind of frustration that must exist in not being included as part of a response system in your own country and for your own people. I'm going to come back to you, Arun, because I think that's quite similar to repeated kind of narrative that it plays out, which is, we can't work with organizations like Samah because they don't have the capacity, and we need to, give them the framework and give them the strategy, and then they just do the execution. What was this whole capacity question, what was your takeaway from the reporting that we've done on capacity?
Well, I mean, it struck me that that seems to be the number one beef. I guess the number one complaint is this perception that local organizations do not have this capacity, and I think it's pretty much the first thing that comes up if you ask people around the world in different crises, local organizations. What annoys you about this whole localization debate? And the number one thing always seems to be this frustration that people keep telling people that they don't have the capacity, but obviously there's some sort of capacity, there's some sort of response that exists on the ground because people are responding. So what is that? I think it comes down to how different people define that capacity. So is capacity the ability to reach different communities, or is it the ability to receive international funding? Is it the ability to have an office and a fax machine? Is that capacity? I think there is this danger in using in I guess how general the language can be in the aid sector, because we don't really often hear specifics about what people are talking about, and capacity is one of those things.
And even in a country like the Philippines, which we've reported from, which in principle would be the perfect model for a locally led response, those same kinds of complaints existed.
Yeah, in some ways, in Mindanao, in the Philippines, during the siege of Marawi in 2017, you've had local organizations with big networks who had responded to disasters and crises before, and they had the structures that mirror the international aid system, what the system expects. And there was a conflict, and they were there on the ground, and internationals could not go into the most affected areas, so the locals were there. So it seems like a system where that would be the opportunity to see whether this works, because there's no other choice. But I think all these local organizations, they still have the same complaints that you see in every crisis. Is these poor partnerships, the short-term funding based on projects and programs that came from above, and not really listening to what they had in mind, being from these communities. So I don't know. It struck me as if it didn't happen there, if localization could not have happened there, then where does it start?
Yeah. Again, my perspective was not a humanitarian one, and looking at Canada in this case as an example, and taking that same point and looking at the difference in time scale. The city I went to was Iqaluit, and Iqaluit is the capital of a relatively new territory in Canada called Nunavut. And Nunavut is only 20 years old. And before Nunavut, Iqaluit was there, but before Nunavut became a territory and Iqaluit its capital, there were smaller villages around, and before that even there was more subsistence living. So Nunavut was designed to become an Inuit-driven territory in Canada. That was the purpose, and that was the agreement that formed it. But what happens is Iqaluit is also a headquarters for national government offices, as well as for territorial offices, as well as local offices. And if you look at the capacity of the management of the organizations within Nunavut, you have 87% of the administrative jobs are filled with Inuit personnel. But 27, 19%, 30% of the administrative positions within the government are filled by, or are either not filled at all.
Of the management positions.
Of the management positions are either not filled at all or are filled with non-Inuk. And so, and there is only one 2-year college in all of North Canada. And that college is designed to put out teachers and nurses, essentially. They have an environmental sciences studies program that is a good one, but it's a 2-year specialty. And so anyone from the community who wants to be trained in any of the sciences, and now we're talking about a city and a territory that is on the forefront the front lines of climate change because of melting permafrost and unstable ice. So you have all sorts of researchers from around the world looking at these communities as the place to study, and you don't have trained Inuit to study with them, to guide them, to give them the perspective of the community. And if they want to learn those skills, they have to leave at substantial expense and cultural change to go to a university to study those things. And that's not uncommon with indigenous communities. It's certainly not uncommon with a lot of minority communities and other vulnerable communities. But in an indigenous context, where you need those cultures, you want to strengthen the culture at the same time you're strengthening the variety of capacities needed to make decisions themselves and to make change based on their cultural values that they think are important. It's a time commitment that many in the West or non-indigenous don't have a mindset. There are programs that are development programs, environmental programs, Maori environmental programs that are thinking about 50 and 100 years into the future. Well, if we can't do it within a political cycle of a 2-year representative being elected or a 4-year representative being elected, we tend not to think of it in those terms. And so we need to think, if from that, you need it immediately on the ground to be able to not necessarily develop, but see where the capacity is and go for it. At the same time, we need to look over time, 10 years, 20 years, at young people who will take the leadership roles in engineering, public policy, medicine, or whatever. And then they will be the ones that will be able to influence the decision-making so that their voices are heard.
But this is a case of actually building up that capacity. What I think must be very frustrating is when the capacity clearly exists and isn't being tapped into. And I wanted to turn to you, Guido. Guido Calderon is the executive director of a Guatemalan NGO called ASEDE. And I should mention that, I mean, Samah almost didn't make it out of Gaza to be here. Guido has come all the way from Guatemala, so it's really great to be able to get your perspectives. Guido also is the Guatemalan representative on an NGO consortium in Central America called Concertación. And last year when Guatemala was hit by the volcano eruption, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which funds that DRR network, decided, instead of giving the money as we normally do to Oxfam to respond because they have the capacity, you know, we've been working with this group for years to try to build up their capacity. Let's take a massive risk and give half of that money to the local network and try to do things a little bit differently and see what happens. Guido, how did that turn out, that experience? And he'll speak in Spanish and then we'll have a translation afterwards.
Guido,
Okay.
Guido, frases cortas, por favor.
Short sentences, please.
Estamos acá un grupo de representantes
There
de la
is a group
concertación
of representation from the regional platform for risk reduction from Central America.
que somos parte de 4 países,
We
Guatemala,
are
El Salvador,
for
Honduras y Nicaragua.
Countries, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua.
Tenemos, somos 125 organizaciones de
We
los 4
are
países
125 organizations from the 4 countries.
y tenemos una red que, de las organizaciones que funcionan en los 4 países desde hace un aproximado de 15 años.
And we have a network of the 4 countries that works for more than, ¿cuántos años, Guido?
15.
15 years.
Muchas de las organizaciones empezamos a trabajar en la respuesta
Many organizations started to work on the response
a raíz del impacto del huracán Mitch en
due
la
to
región.
the impact of the Mitch hurricane in the region.
Y hacemos respuesta, pero también hacemos todo el
And we
proceso
do response, but also we do all the process of
de preparación de las comunidades para enfrentar los eventos
preparedness of communities to deal with the events.
y nos quedamos después de la respuesta haciendo todo el proceso de reconstrucción.
And after the response, we stayed there to do all the reconstruction process.
Porque además tenemos presencia en los territorios de las
Because
comunidades
in
vulnerables
addition, we have presence in the territories of the vulnerable communities.
y nuestro trabajo está junto con el liderazgo tanto de mujeres como de hombres en las comunidades.
And our work is together with the leaderships of both men and women in the communities.
Recientemente en Guatemala estamos respondiendo a la erupción del volcán de fuego.
Recently, we are responding in Guatemala to the eruption of the fire volcano
Con financiamientos directos, sin intermediarios de ONGs internacionales,
with direct financing without intermediaries of intermediary organizations.
que han llegado de distintos donantes, dentro de ellos la Fundación de Bill y Melinda Gates.
This financing has come from different donors, among them the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Pero la región centroamericana está constantemente impactada por eventos.
But the Central American region is permanently impacted by different events.
Tenemos varios volcanes activos,
We have several active volcanoes.
tenemos 3 placas tectónicas que provocan sismos constantemente.
We have 3 tectonic plates that create permanent earthquakes, constant earthquakes.
Los 4 países que he mencionado son parte de la lista de los países que son impactados por el cambio climático.
The 4 countries I have mentioned are in the list of the countries impacted by the climate change.
Y además la región centroamericana no ha querido ser reconocida como una de las que tienen alta vulnerabilidad al impacto de los desastres.
And the Central American region hasn't been recognized as one of the most impacted regions by the climate change.
Porque dice que somos países de renta media, pero la
Because they
distribución,
say we are a middle rent country.
pero la distribución de la riqueza está en pocas manos, entonces la pobreza es la que recibe el impacto de los
But
desastres.
wealth distribution is in few hands, so the poor are the ones that are most affected.
Guido, antes que das toda una historia de la región, are you still able to translate if I speak in English?
Yes.
Yes, okay. What I found really interesting about your case is that, in fact, you received direct, ¿me entiendes?
Sí, sí,
Sí.
sí.
You received direct funding from the European Union decades ago, in fact, when there was a civil war in Guatemala, to do the response. And now, 20 years later, you're being asked whether you have the capacity to respond to a volcano eruption. So I don't quite understand how you react to the argument around capacity.
Normalmente nos dicen que no tenemos capacidad,
Usually
aunque
we
sí
are
la tenemos.
told we don't have capacity, though we have capacity.
La respuesta que hacemos las organizaciones locales es mucho más barata que la respuesta que puede hacer una organización internacional.
The response local organizations provide is cheaper than the response international organizations give.
El impacto que tiene el apoyo nuestro en las comunidades donde ya estamos
The
es mucho más
impact
alto.
We have on the communities we are working with is higher.
Y casi siempre nos toca responder a las necesidades de hombres y de mujeres en
Usually,
esos procesos.
we respond to the needs of men and women in those processes
Porque tenemos un conocimiento del día a día que viven las comunidades.
because we have a knowledge on daily basis of the needs of the communities.
Entonces, ¿por qué dicen que no tienes capacidad? Why did they tell you you don't have capacity then?
Porque por un lado no tenemos una oficina en Europa
Because
o
on
en
one
Estados
hand,
Unidos,
we don't have an office in Europe or in the United States.
porque no tenemos, no somos parte del sector humanitario a nivel global,
Because we are not part of the humanitarian sector at global level.
no somos parte del sistema de Naciones Unidas.
We are not part of the United Nations system.
Y así puedo hacer una gran lista que nos va descalificando y descalificando.
And I can present you a whole list of agencies that are disqualifying us.
aunque de todos modos en las respuestas como la del volcán,
Though, in a ways, in responses, as in the case of the volcano,
nos toca recoger toda la basura que las ONGs internacionales dejan.
we have to pick all the garbage the international NGOs leave in our countries.
Gracias, Guido.
Okay.
Thank you, Guido.
So Guido is good-hearted about it. Guido can complain with a smile on his face, but I think many of the people you spoke to were deeply frustrated. And actually, this is a conversation we have at the Geneva level all the time, and yet I'm not sure policymakers at the Geneva level understand the level of the frustration that you encountered in a lot of the stories.
I think that's fair to say. I think the people who speak with me and the people who speak with the reporters who work with us are quick to talk about these sorts of frustrations. And I don't know if they're so quick to do that in person, in meetings on the ground, when you have to be a bit more diplomatic. I think that's an issue. I think I feel like there's no safe space to discuss this, and I hate to use that safe space word for something like this. We shouldn't need a safe space. But I think there's a reluctance to discuss things honestly, perhaps on both sides. And I think, for me, I feel the onus is on local responders to define what localization is. And we've had a bunch of research come out over the last 3 years to ask local responders, and that makes sense. You need that, but I don't see the equivalent coming from internationals. I don't see the equivalent of saying, this is what we're willing to do, this is what we're not willing to do, and this is why. If you can't start with there, then we'll always just be talking about this localization as this future aspect, this future thing that may or may not happen. And it's been 3 years since the World Humanitarian Summit. So obviously these sorts of frustrations, I think, they're expressed, I think, to people like us in the media maybe a bit more forcefully than they are expressed in person sometimes. But obviously that depends on the context.
I was struck because we were speaking and you said it's almost like talking about race relations in the United States, which I found a crazy comparison, but that's how you see it.
I don't think, it's not a direct comparison, but I think there is this level of, you can't, I think that's why we always have these comments like, oh, they don't have the capacity, locals don't have the capacity to do this or do that. But what does that actually mean? That's code word for not being specific. And then if you're not being specific, then you can't have that discussion. And then we keep on doing forums like this. So yeah, I mean, obviously race relations and localization completely separate, but there is this danger.
Well, they're not always completely separate, actually, but
fair enough.
Maybe a different discussion. I want to I'll come to you in a minute, John, but I want to add a bit of nuance to this because often the debate is local versus international and the frustrations between the two. But in fact, there's a whole other set of frustrations within the local level. And I wanted to turn to you, Nahuel, because this is something you've been looking at. Nahuel Arenas is the Deputy Chief of the Regional Office for the Americas and the Caribbean at UNISDR, now UNDRR, the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency. And you are leading a session, as I understand it. It will work eventually. It just takes a minute to wake up. We've put it to sleep with our discussion. You're leading a session later this week at the Global Platform on promoting locally led DRR. But I wonder, from the vantage point of that coordinating body working between local government, local communities, and private sector, to what extent there isn't also some frustration among different parts of the local community.
Thank you. Perhaps offer another angle to the discussion. I would like to offer a reflection and an invitation as well. The reflection, I work with many local NGOs. I work with INGOs for many years, supporting, promoting, and seeking to enable local leadership in DRR and humanitarian response. And with many particularly with Oxfam, we always sought to coordinate and to engage with local authorities. Yet our main efforts were focused on the local organizations, on the local networks. For the last 2 years or so, I've been working with the UN, with UNDRR. UNDRR has a very successful campaign that is called Making Cities Resilient campaign. More than 4,000 local governments have adhered to this campaign, and the campaign seeks to support local governments developing local DRR strategies and plans. And while our tools, our methodologies, the process we engage and promote always seek to engage other actors and to promote a participatory approach, our main partner, our main interlocutor is the local government. So my reflection is that I feel that these two efforts are sometimes going in different avenues. And we might be missing a very important link between different actors at the local level to really unlock the potential of local leadership. And not only talking about local organizations and the authorities, also the private sector. There's very few, or let's say the conversations with the private sector at the local level is very limited. And see, there's, interestingly, there's a tension for local governments always between the responsibilities they have and the authority they have, or the power, not to talk about their capacities. And last year we undertook a global study across 50 cities around the world. In this study, they self-score are around 10 domains of resilience. And some of these domains are technical capacity, financial capacity, level of preparedness. You can anticipate that they self-score quite low on technical and financial capacity. Yet the capacity that scores the highest, that self-scores the highest, is the capacity and their power to engage in partnerships. So where that...
the government's capacity?
Yes. Where that authority and responsibility meet the most is the capacity to engage in partnerships. So I think we should work with this. We is, I think, international cooperation do more to encourage local actors, again, organizations, communities, authorities, and private sector to talk more to each other, to work more with each other, and to build more on each other's capacity. So that's a reflection. And the invitation is, as you have mentioned, with a big group of partners and colleagues from IFRC, WIRU, GNDR, ODI, experts, which is another word for non-researchers, and agencies. We have put together a session that is called Promoting Locally Led DRR, DRM, Challenges, Solutions, and Lessons Learned at the platform. This is on Thursday, 4:30 p.m. And we are putting together a representative from the donors' perspective, actually the director of DG ECHO, Ms. Paya. We are inviting local leaders as well as local authorities. And so that we can have a conversation about how they are talking to each other, how much
or not talking to each
other. And they will share their experiences. And one of the lessons that I think will come up is that we need to identify the ways, and you know, we talk about best practices, but I think we need to identify a list of transferable lessons for how governments and other actors can really institutionalize sustainable locally led DRR. So you're invited to participate, and thank you for the invitation.
So I want to turn to kind of the way forward, because I think the complaints and the frustrations are becoming pretty well known, but there has been some progress, probably nowhere near as much as many people expected in this agenda. And I think one of the ways forward is to redefine what we mean by localization. So to your point about this isn't just local communities, it's also local governments, and to what extent are they working in the same direction? Sisira, this is a point you often also make, Sisira Madhupar. It's too long, too many vowels, too many syllables. Madhuraparuma. There, I got it eventually. Heads up the capacity building portfolio at the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, which is an intergovernmental organization working to build the resilience of people and institutions to disasters and climate change in Asia and the Pacific. And you often say, this definition of localization is so narrow. So how do we change that definition moving forward in a way that might be a little bit more constructive?
So let me stand so that they don't see my back, so they can see me. Well, just before this discussion, I just had the look on the Global Humanitarian Assessment report just to get some insight. I must tell you that it's very scary. Figures are very scary when it comes to localization. And I mean, in preparation for World Humanitarian Summit, we did some research, and there were some discussions, and in the World Humanitarian Summit, there were a number of forums and discussions around localization. And after that, of course, in Cancun we discussed, and in the upcoming GPDRR, there would be a number of sessions around localization and innovation and so on. That said, fact remains that the resources going to the local NGOs around 2.9, 2.7, which has been the case for last 5-6 years, if not more. So look like it is not just happening. We are just talking, but it is not just happening. Let us make the story straight. So given that context, I believe that we need to redefine what localization means instead of using it as a buzzword. Let us not abuse the word localization. So if this so-called international humanitarian funding is not directing towards the local organization, we are impatient. We cannot just wait and see. There should be some systems and mechanisms in place at the local level so that the at-risk communities would be in place would be ready to face some of the impending disasters. With that background, what we are doing is basically trying to understand and trying to redefine what localization means. So there are few examples that I can tell you. One is, of course, the work that we do in Bihar. Bihar is one of the states in India which housed about 106 million population. It's not a small state per se. And what we do with the government of Bihar is basically how we work with the government of Bihar in investing on resilience and investing on preparedness without just waiting for aid agencies to reallocate whatever billions international humanitarian assistance for response, because it is just not happening. What we work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is that basically making that enabling environment, making that policy instrument, making that technical capacity available within the government system so that we use these limited resources, which ideally would have used for humanitarian response, for resilience building. So that government can invest on resilience building. Just to give a simple example, the Gates Foundation invested about $1 million. That work as animator, and that led for the government of Bihar to invest more than $200 million. So my point is that when it comes to the limited amount international resources coming to the countries, if we make more innovative solutions, innovative ways of doing the work, then the amount of investment that government can mobilize and do is much, much higher. Because this is one of the alternatives perhaps we can tap into in countries like India and Bihar, a state like Bihar. Another point I just would like to highlight here is that capacity is so subjective. You may say that there is no local capacity at the local level, but we need to define what capacity means. It's so subjective. We can also argue that the international organizations do not have capacity in certain aspects at the local level when it comes to numbers, when it comes to outreach, and so on and so forth. I can keep big list, right? So it's so subjective. I think it's a scapegoat. Just let us accept the fact that it is not true. There are capacities, but we need to make sure that we tap into those capacities and we become more innovative and we mobilize partners around those. My last example is that there is a partnership called Asian Preparedness Partnership, or APP, which is led by 6 countries from Asia, which basically it's a partnership by the government, civil society network, and the private sector. And whole idea is that they lead it. My suggestion is that let these partnerships emerge, let these partnerships blossom, so that they can do much more than perhaps what international organizations do. And we can observe, perhaps, we can provide technical assistance, but if we try to mediate this, I would say that they will even go apart from each other. Let them merge, let them blossom, let them produce more results, let them leverage, and let them build their capacity, because as of now, I really wish that this real localization happen, but if it is not happening, we are impatient. I think we got to do something.
I like the strategy, sidestep them all together and leverage the local government's capacity to make this stuff happen. We're going to do a lightning round now because we started a bit late and we'll run a few minutes over, but we need really short answers from folks about ways forward. So, Erwin, one way forward that you've seen from what you've heard in the stories we've reported.
Well, I think it's not really a way forward. It's just an easy thing. It's for international organizations to stop taking credit for local work in things as simple as press releases, things like that. It happens all the time, and that's a real frustration, I think. But that doesn't actually change, that doesn't make localization happen, but that is, I think, one of the sore points that keeps coming up with in my conversations.
John, one way forward for the Indigenous communities.
Well, I have Indigenous heritage as I was introduced, and so that gives me a little bit of credibility to travel to communities and talk with members of Indigenous communities. But the way forward needs to be that those Indigenous peoples have their own voice. And one specific idea, we have our UNDRR representative here, is I've proposed formally to UNDRR that we have an international year of Indigenous disaster risk reduction. And there, as you may know, there are several, you referenced the Resilient Cities campaign. That started out as a 2-year initiative and then continued. Ciro Ugarte from the Pan American Health Organization, World Health Organization, is sitting next to you. He was one of the principals of Safe Hospitals, now Smart Hospitals, which was an international initiative. And so there are many things within the establishment that are within establishments that have been developed as positive programs that have proven to be effective, that are not available culturally or linguistically to Indigenous communities, more broadly to other communities as well. Language and culture are challenges that we have in sharing information. But the idea during a year's time frame, or during an annual or international year, the idea would be to, among other things, survey those materials that have proven effective in various environments, work with Indigenous communities to adapt them to a culturally and linguistically appropriate way. For example, the Resilient Cities had 10 essentials for effective risk reduction. There was also a focus on things that mayors could do or local government organizers could do. They need to be adapted culturally and linguistically so that they're accessible and usable. So I think there are some things that we need to do like that. And then at the end of that year, we would look toward the next ISDR, UNDRR platform and call on UN member states and Sendai framework partners to identify at least 2 delegates from each of their countries, pay for them, help them plan for it, bring them to the platform, let them have their voice, and don't put them in a session that just says this is the Indigenous session, because everything that's of interest to anybody is of interest to an Indigenous person. They
Lightning
need to
round,
be
John.
in all
Lightning
sessions.
round.
Okay, sorry. That was a heat lightning. It wasn't a bolt.
I want to there's one quite tangible thing that's happening in terms of moving this agenda forward. So I did want to make sure everyone is aware of that. Sema, if you can share with us what the NEAR Network is doing. The NEAR Network, as many of you will know, is a movement of grassroots Global South organizations that are trying to push the localization agenda forward, and Sema is the acting chair. And you've got a number of tools, but maybe just really 30-second overview.
Okay. Hello, everyone. So we at NEAR are a network of 286 local actors from the Global South. And we were born 3 years ago, precisely from the frustrations that you talk about, Heba. As local actors, we felt we weren't being acknowledged, even worse, that we were being overpowered by the big players. That are there in the humanitarian system. So we thought, okay, so why don't we do something about this? And we established a network. It was around the time of the World Humanitarian Summit, and serious commitments have been made around localization. We've heard about the Grand Bargain. We know about the Charter for Change commitments. So we said, okay, great, these commitments are there, but who's going to hold them accountable? We must make sure that these commitments don't stay only at the policy level, but they trickle down to the ground level. So as the network, we said, let's develop a tool where we can actually measure if we are moving in that direction and how we're moving in that direction. So localization is a grand concept. It's an abstract concept. So with the members of the network, we said, let's break it down to its components, and we developed indicators for how we might measure the way forward. Something else that we're working on quickly is a harmonized due diligence mechanism. As local actors, we go through so many different due diligence processes with every partnership that we have, but we said perhaps we can harmonize that so that we actually facilitate local actors accessing humanitarian funds. And we talk a lot about capacity, but in fact capacity just oftentimes means do we have the capacity for donor compliance? And in the Grand Bargain, for example, there are commitments on less reporting and less paperwork. So we thought perhaps we could also try to minimize some of those conditions for local actors to access. So this is a work in progress.
And a reminder that in the reception you can obviously approach any of the people that you've heard from tonight for more detail. Since we're here at the Global Platform, I do want to turn to Valeria. Where are you? There you are in the corner. So Valeria Driga is with the Global Network for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a consortium of NGOs working on DRR, and has a very concrete idea about how to move this agenda forward.
Right, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it links a bit with what you were saying from the NEAR network. As boring as it can be, monitoring and reporting on indicators is actually a very good way of institutionalizing new trends. So a suggestion that has been brought up by different civil society stakeholders within GNDR, the Global Network for Disaster Reduction, but also with other stakeholders is, why don't we push governments to include custom indicators on inclusion and how they engage with civil society, with local actors, how do they bring them into the conversation when it comes to disaster risk reduction policy making and plans. There's actually, at the moment, there's no indicator in the Sendai monitor that monitors inclusion of local actors. And if we're able to include some of this data and information into the reporting system to the Sendai framework, it would be a good way of institutionalizing inclusion of local actors. Some GNDR members are doing it at the local level, so they're through a program called Views from the Frontline, they're monitoring levels of inclusion of communities within local DRR plans and policies. But I think if this can be scaled up at the national level, it would bring the conversation about localization and inclusion to a different level, possibly in the next global platform.
Thank you, Valeria. I just want to touch on one last point because this came up in our reporting, and I think in terms of the way forward is quite an important one, which is the gender lens of localization. And maybe you could speak really briefly about what you came across in at least one interview that you did on this topic, and then get some suggestions from the field about how we push that agenda forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's I suppose one of the unspoken aspects of localization. If established groups are led by men and more money is going to these established groups, what happens to women-led organizations? Is there this push to have gender issues at the forefront in localization? Is that a weakness? I don't think it is, but it is one of these elements where I think people haven't really thought this through. And if you follow through to put the money through to these established local organizations and they are led by men, then how responsive are these responses on the ground? And I think there are different answers to that question, but it is a good question to ask, I think, for us as reporters.
So Rulla, if you can give us your vantage point. Rulla Zaitar is an aid worker in Lebanon who works with an organization called RDFL, I guess, which translates to the Lebanese Democratic Women's Gathering, which is trying to do exactly that, women-led organizations that are trying to build resilience among Syrian refugees in Lebanon. How do you ensure that as the international community tries to direct more resources to the local level, that it doesn't reinforce kind of patriarchal systems? And what do you see as the way forward in terms of women leading the localization agenda?
مرحبا، رولا من لبنان. جمعيتي جمعية نسوية بتشتغل على قضايا النساء، فبتواجهنا كثير من التحديات اللي بطبيعة الحال ما بتخلي النساء توصل للمشاريع.
بس جملة عشان تترجم لك. اوكي خلاص كلميني الأول.
طيب. فنحن عم تواجهنا بالمنظمات الخاصة النسوية جملة من التحديات، خاصة إنه المنظمات الدولية بس عم تعطي تمويل، عم تعطيها لمنظمات أو جمعيات محلية بتقودها رجال، فالمشاريع بتجي وفق ما هن بدهم يلا.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rula. I'm coming from a feminist organization. In Lebanon, it's always noticed that this fund is coming to mostly women that are organizations that are led by men, and they are not mainly supporting feminist organization or women-led organization. So the interventions does not respond actually to the women's needs.
فبيشتغلوا على تعزيز السلطة الأبوية أكثر للبرامج اللي بيعملوها، فبتجي هيدي بيعززوا الصورة النمطية للمرأة بالمشاريع اللي بيقدموا لنا إياها، فبتكون المرأة عم تشتغل بمشاريع اللي هي معتادة عليها، الخياطة، التطريز، الطبخ وهي الأشياء بدون ما نمكنها لتصير قيادية.
Which promotes the patriarchal system and stresses and emphasizes on it. So eventually we end up doing the same stereotype, stressing on the stereotypes that women are known for, like doing vocational trainings on sewing, hairdressing, makeup, nothing innovative and out of the box for women.
وهيدي المشاريع بتكون آنية، ما بتخليها تعمل استدامة لحتى هيدي المرأة تتكل على نفسها وتتكيف مع الواقع المستجد لها، فبتكون أكثر عم بتروح هدر التمويلات على مشاريع بتخلص بس ينتهي المشروع.
And those interventions are normally comes in short periods, so there's no sustainability. When the project is done, nothing happens after that. We didn't build in the capacity of the women.
وكمان بتواجهنا نحن كجمعيات انه الاجنده المشاريع اللي بتيجي من المنظمات الدوليه هي بتيجي جاهزه وكامله، فبتنفرض علينا فرض بدل ما نكون عم نعمل دراسه للواقع ودراسه لاحتياجات الفئات المستهدفه لتكون تعمل انتاجيه افضل، يكون في رياده افكار، يكون في ابتكار بالعمل لحتى نغير الواقع المستجد للنساء اللي نحن عم نشتغل معهم.
Donors normally tend to impose their agendas and strategies, as mentioned before, on all the organizations and mainly women-led organizations. So they do not consult with the community. They do not check on their priorities. They don't do the proper assessments. So their response doesn't actually respond to the actual needs of the woman.
كمان في آخر نقطة في كتير من التحديات اللي نحن بتواجهنا، لكن كمان مشكلة بتواجه المنظمات النسوية. ما في ثقة بعمل المنظمات النسوية لأنه بيتهموها بأنها عم بتحرر المرأة وعم بتغير من ثقافة المجتمع والتقاليد والعادات، وعم بتكسر القيود المحيطة بالمرأة لتصير أقوى وإلها دور فعال بالمجتمع. ما في ثقة من الكوميونتي بالمنظمات النسوية، فبتخلق لنا إشكالية كبيرة بتعطل العمل لحتى نقدر نحقق الأهداف اللي بنكون واضعينها ببرامجنا.
The last point is there is a lack of trust from the community in the feminist organizations because it's a patriarchal system, so they promote that they are liberating the woman, and this is something that the men doesn't want in our area, in our region. So they don't give the space for feminist organizations to work as they should be working.
Thank
Shukran,
you.
Rola. I know we've hammered you with information. That's the kind of new humanitarian style of being overly ambitious of what we can cover in an hour and a half. But if we've piqued your interest in any of these topics, we will be carrying out a phase 2 of the reporting that we began last year, which may shift a little bit from the individual stories to some of the wider trends that we're seeing around progress on localization, but also the role of government and the private sector. And John will be doing a third case study in Ethiopia. So if you're interested in any more information, as I said, you can subscribe to our website. You can see the stories directly at thenewhumanitarian.org/local aid, and you can ask John to keep you in the loop of where the case studies will be published online, which eventually they will. I would now like to thank all of the interventions. It's always quite complicated, actually, to weave in so many different perspectives, but we felt it was really important not to speak on behalf of local organizations, but for you to also have the opportunity to hear from them directly, which was why we kind of went out of our way to ensure those voices were present. But you'll, as I say, be able to touch base with these two guys during the reception, and so please join me in giving them a round of applause. And to close us off, I'm going to invite Dr. Valerie Bimo, the Deputy Director of Global Development at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who leads their emergency response work, to give her closing reflections and usher us towards the drinks. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Hiba, and thank you, John and Hevin, for the debate. Actually, it was really rich, and I don't even know where to start, but I will try to be brief because I don't want to be the one between the drinks and me. As Hiba said, my name is Valerie Bimo. I work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I think two things. First, to say why we, as a Gates Foundation, what we are doing and why we are doing that. And I think as the Gates Foundation, people don't know much about our humanitarian work. It's not known as much. But also, it's not even known so much about our capacity building or our local organization work, because it's not necessarily what we're doing. And I think it's not part of necessarily the organization, although this is something that is still important, but it's not necessarily a priority. And I have to be upfront on that. And as many of us talk about international community, there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of saying, but it's not necessarily either easy or feasible, but also it's not done because it requires a lot of effort. It requires a lot of time. It requires a lot of thinking out of the box because the system is so heavy. The system is so complex. The system is so many layers that actually it makes it complex and difficult. You really need to be out of the box. You really need to do extra effort to be able to do something. And it's not, I will not blame anybody, but this is just the reality. And as John was talking about the credibility, I think I have some credibility as well because I'm not born in US, I'm born in Africa. I'm from Africa, I grew up in Africa, I did my study in Africa. But I have the opportunity earlier on my career to have international opportunity to go around the world and to work with different NGOs, to work with different places around the world. But even for me, who were educated, intellectual, going around, having experience, I have to face myself the same frustration that all of them is talking about. That it's not about, are you local or you're local, because I don't know what I'll call myself. I am local or I am international. I'm both. And I think this is really where the conversation have to start. How do we define it? Because it becomes so much a buzzword. We have so much buzzword that we start talking since the World Humanitarian Summit, all this buzzword of localization came in, but actually, is it any progress? No. Is it different from 10 years ago? No. Are we talking about it more? Yes. Are we doing something? No. Then, I think it's all everybody's responsibilities, and it's everybody have to start really thinking, we have to start really thinking after the box, and start really saying, what do we do? Because I want to start looking forward. As Bill and Melinda said, we are optimists, but we are impatient optimists. And I want to copy that because sometimes I get, as you can hear the tone of my voice, I can get really passionate, I can get a bit irritated, but I also want to do something. And as we started at the foundation, I really started to say, how can we do it? Because I've been in the space where I've been frustrated myself. I've been in the space where, even at the bigger organization, I work with one of the biggest organizations from the international, but sometimes I've been treated as a lower, and I have to work 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times more to demonstrate that I have the capability. Then how do you want even the person who is not even probably don't speak in the language, probably not dressed in the same way, probably have never traveled and never exposed to any of these forums, don't even know what is the language, but they just know what to do. And I think this is from that perspective that I start looking at different ways. And I took steps to look at projects, ways to prove the concept that is possible. To prove the concept that is possible as you create ownership, as you trust the people, as you create relationship, and you ask them, what do you think? There's so much capacity, there's so much knowledge. But it's just for us to, how do we tap that? And how do we work on that? And I think, in the other hand, this is really one part of the things. But as I start learning to work with from local and ground ups, I realize there's a lot of challenge as well. First, it's disconnected from the reality, it's disjointed, because you have, as we discussed here, you have local, national, district government, you have different local NGOs, faith-based, non-faith-based, women, feminists, local, not local, men. It's so disjointed as well. And it makes it even more difficult. And of course, it gives occasion and a word to say, you know, it's too disorganized, it's two different things, and they don't have capacity. We can't do that because the capacity, some have, some may not have as much. But I think it's also, it's my cry to also the local organization. We can cry as much as we want. We can actually push as much as we want, but we need to step up as well. Because playing the victim will not solve the issues. Stopping will not solve the issues. And as Paul Ferreira said, freedom is not come as a gift. You have to conquer it. It's a conquest. Then actually, my point is that as a local capacity, as the people themselves, they need to step up. And we need to probably give them a hand. And I'm glad that the new Humanitarian start giving them voices. Because I think this is how we can start having it. And this type of event where, for once, I'm happy that we have a speaking from grounds up, And then we have voice for people who actually are not just in movies, but they are here. They are speaking. And we saw that Hiba has a difficulty stopping them because they have so much to say. How can we give them more voices? How can we make sure that they are part of at the table to say their own story and not be translated for someone else? How do we make sure that they get exposed to share their opinion? How do we make sure that, and I'm glad one person was talking about, we were not even part of the design of the project. How do we make sure that they are part of that design, that their voice are heard? And I think, and I really look at Nawel, I think the UNDR now, is it that what it is? Have a big role to play, but be honest. Let us not start another UN way to say, oh, we care about them, but we just start coming up here, and by the time we get there, it's just a kind of dust. Please, I'm looking at you because I know you specifically, and I'll cry at you to say, let us for once do something differently. Let's for once have an innovative way of doing it. Let's for once having them sitting. And I hope in your session on Thursday that they will be sitting at the table, not just calling also when we want to showcase. I hope they will be part of the conversation. And I think it's all of us, and it's not international or local. We all have our role to play, but we all have to be blamed as well. How much can we do, all of us together? And this is my cry to, we are all in the same boat, and we should be part of the same solution, and we have to stop to say whose fault is it, but we have to start looking forward to say how can we take step by step. And I'm glad that NIER took some action. How can we start even measuring it? What can we define it better? How can we start engaging the local and national government? They have money. A lot of them have money. Even the local organization, how can you start going to your government before going to the international? Go to your own government. Hey, we need to sit at the table. And one of the projects, as Cecilia mentioned, where we have the partnership within the private sector, the civil society, and the government, for the first time, some of organizations, local, they say it's the first time we sit with our own government. Even our own government. Why we complain about the international? Even the same national don't call the civil society on the table. Let us fight there, because that is the only way. How the policy are made, we have budget included. And I think my list can go on. How can we tap in the private sector? They are the big provider of employment. Are they resilient themselves to be providing the job? Are they doing the job? And I want to appeal all of us to go with the open-minded, to start looking at solution versus blaming a victim. Let us really be open, because there's so much possibilities, but it's all of us. We can do some small proof of context, but unless we scale it, we'll not make it. Then this is my positive, optimistic view to say, please look outside of the box and make sure that the people themselves give you solution. They are smart, they are knowledgeable, even if they are affected, even if they lost everything because of the long crisis, they still have their brain, they still have their hope, their dream, their aspiration, their heart, and they can actually take care of themselves. Thank you, and have a nice evening.